and I am going to invite my colleague from the History Department, Dr. Scott Latterman, to give a few remarks on where UMD and the University of Minnesota's system fits and what some of our concerns might be as we move forward with the process of prioritization. Scott?
All right, thank you, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, I was asked to speak about administrative growth and spending in Minnesota, which I suppose means I'm the chump who agreed to commit career suicide tonight. But in all seriousness, I hope all seriousness, with Professor Ginsberg's coming to campus, I was asked to explore and then spent about 15 minutes presenting on the extent to which the major themes of his book apply to the University of Minnesota and to UMD. Now, this is a bit unfair because, of course, he hasn't spoken yet, and if you haven't read his book, what I'm going to say may not seem as relevant, but of course, people didn't come here to see me tonight, they came here to see him, and we're going to save the best for last. So you're just going to have to bear with me for a few minutes here while I get through this. Now, like many of us, I have seen the numerous job postings that have gone out over the UMD email system over the years that appear to suggest considerable growth in the administrative ranks. And this has certainly piqued my curiosity. So, to evaluate this question of administrative growth, administrative spending, I poured through all sorts of data to see what I could find. Now, before I say more, a quick qualification is in order. Data at the University of Minnesota are frustratingly opaque and sometimes inconsistent, even contradictory. Trying to make sense of this data is a Herculean task. There are internal campus data, there are data that are reported to the regents, there are data reported to IPEDS, which is the federal government's integrated post-secondary education data system. And these data do not always match up. But the available data, I think, are quite suggestive. And what they suggest is that some of what Professor Ginsberg argues in his book, and about which he'll be speaking tonight, is in fact applicable to the University of Minnesota and to UMD. But not all of it. Now, we have a relatively new administration on campus now, and this means we have both a choice and an opportunity. Will we continue to move in the direction that Professor Ginsberg is going to describe tonight, or will we go the other way? Now, to situate the University of Minnesota in context, I want to start with a report that was published in December of last year by the Wall Street Journal. This is a report that identified the University of Minnesota as essentially a poster child for administrative bloat. Of 72 very high research public universities in 2011-2012, the journal reported that the Twin Cities campus had the largest share of employees classified as executive, administrative, and managerial. From 2001 to 2012, according to the newspaper, the University of Minnesota system added 1,000 new administrators. Their ranks grew 37%, more than twice as fast as the teaching corps, and nearly twice as fast as the student body. In 2012, 81 people with administrative titles were making over $200,000 a year. In 2001, even accounting for inflation, that number was 39. Now, President Kaler, president of the University of Minnesota, responded that more administrative staff were needed to attend to the myriad regulations associated with the U's growing research funds, to improve the student experience, and to manage complex technology. He also said that the University of Minnesota classifies its employees differently from other universities. At the same time, Kaler pointed to a bigger problem in why tuition has gone up, and it's rising tuition that's really generated much of this concern over administrative bloat, and that is the disinvestment by the state in public higher education. And he's right. With cuts in state funding, public higher ed has essentially been privatized, and this is something that I think should concern all of us who see education as a public good. But critics say Kaler's response failed to fully account for the rise in administrative spending. In fact, his administration conceded that it couldn't even identify the number of administrators that work for the university and pledged to reduce administrative costs. And then quite recently, some of you may have read in the newspaper, he said that he will cut $90 million from administrative spending over the next 6 years. Now, this report in the Wall Street Journal followed an earlier public embarrassment. In February of last year, the Star Tribune reported that administrators were being paid big bucks on their way out. And Exhibit A for these golden parachutes was in fact the former chancellor of UMD who retired in the summer of 2010. When she retired, she was given a 2-month sabbatical, a 15-month, what was called administrative transitional leave, final deposits to her retirement fund, and a severance check. The total that she was paid over the 18 months after she supposedly left the university was $535,000, which is more than she earned in the 2 years prior to her retirement. Now, other retiring or departing UMD administrators in recent years have also been given amorphously defined special projects that allow them to collect another semester or year of pay after they supposedly left. One former vice chancellor was given the task of rethinking what UMD considers its peer institutions. And if there were other projects that he was given, they were not known, at least to the faculty with whom I've spoken. We also had a former dean who left his position at the end of 2010 amidst criticism of excessive spending. And he was tasked with investigating relationship building with universities in Turkey. This meant that he not only continued to collect a salary, but also enjoyed a hefty travel budget. Now let me say that UMD, when considered against the Twin Cities campus, is relatively lean in terms of administrative spending. But that relative, I think, is important. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're where we should be. Now, before even getting into any of these issues, however, I want to make an important acknowledgement. When I say that we've seen some departures at UMD from Professor Ginsburg's more national conclusions, here's a really important one. If one of Professor Ginsburg's arguments is that the growth of administrators and professional staff in America's universities has precipitated the fall of the faculty, our top 2 administrators at UMD, in fact, deserve the faculty's appreciation. There was no faculty body within the shared governance system at UMD under our previous chancellor. And our current chancellor and our current executive vice chancellor for academic affairs backed faculty efforts to create one. We now have a faculty assembly, and we'll shortly have an elected faculty council. So as frustrating as we might find some of the trends outlined in Professor Ginsburg's work as they pertain to Minnesota, both fairness and decency dictate that we gratefully acknowledge the important contribution of our top administrators to supporting a greater faculty voice in campus governance. I should also add that the new Faculty Assembly and Council put us on a better footing to ensure that some of the trends identified by Professor Ginsburg don't become a problem at UMD. So what do the data tell us about UMD? Well, it's not always pretty. Comparing the campus directories from 1997 and 2012, for instance, one colleague of mine found an increase of 138 new administrative and staff positions during that 15-year period. Now, to be sure, comparing campus directories is an imperfect method, and most of the new positions were low-paid, often shamefully so, support staff. While there are a number of well-paid administrators and professional staff on this campus, most of the staff are, I think it's important to point out, considerably undercompensated, particularly in light of the essential and often thankless work that they do. Nevertheless, this colleague did find that 21 non-faculty director or assistant director positions existed in 2012 that did not exist in 1997. Now, more broadly, the university's annual report to the regents, this is a document called the University Plan, Performance, and Accountability Report, using the new terms created to identify types of employees, has showed continued administrative growth. From 2011 to 2012, over a one-year period, there was an increase of 2 what are called direct academic providers. This can mean everyone from faculty to extension educators and teaching assistants. During that same period, there was an increase of 9 people in what the university calls higher education mission support and university leadership positions. So what are these new positions? Well, it's not always clear, particularly with the administrative shuffle that has happened at UMD in the last few years. But perhaps an example would help. In 2012, UMD split its Office of Financial Aid and Registrar into 2 separate entities, thus moving from 1 director position to 2. A few months later, an associate vice chancellor sent out a letter to select individuals on campus, but not all faculty, announcing that 5 additional jobs were being posted in the new registrar's office. This is, she wrote, the largest staff expansion this campus has seen in a while. And there will be questions and hallway conversation about how this happened. But, she noted in an apparent effort to cover critics, I am assuring you that the need exists. And maybe she was right. I hope so. It does seem odd, however, that 6 more people were needed to do the work that 6 fewer had been doing just a year earlier. It also raises questions about how we prioritize our needs at UMD. In my department, history for instance, we have serious gaps in our curriculum that have gone unaddressed for years. I know this is true of departments across campus. In history, we have not had a single new faculty position since I began at UMD in 2005. Indeed, my department had more faculty 50 years ago when the student population was a fraction of what it is now. At the moment, we have no one to teach, for instance, Latin American and South Asian history, which is, by my rough estimate, about 1/4 of the world's population. We also no longer have anyone to teach women's history, about half of the world's population. Now, to put this in perspective, a colleague of mine crunched the numbers on the number of UMD faculty, administrators, and staff per full-time equivalent student in 2012. The national average for faculty at 4-year public institutions, according to the Center for College Affordability and Productivity, is 8 faculty per 100 full-time equivalent students. At UMD, we have 5.1. The national average for administrators and staff at 4-year public institutions is 6 per 100 full-time equivalent students. At UMD, according to IPED's data, we have 8.4. What we see at UMD, in other words, is an underrepresentation of faculty and an overrepresentation of administrators and staff. Now again, we may not be as bloated as the Twin Cities, but we don't seem to be doing well by national standards. But bodies are only part of the story. The money going to administration is ultimately the most significant statistic. And the data, again, I must caution, can be difficult to decipher. But according to the University of Minnesota's 2013 fiscal pages, the expenditures for instruction at UMD increased roughly $6.2 million, or 11%, from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2013, which is the last year for which data are available. During that same period, the expenditures for academic support and institutional support, which is mostly administration, increased more than $8 million, or about 16%. Moreover, according to data collected by another of my colleagues using the reported salaries associated with administrative job codes, the percentage increase in salaries going to top administrators has been far higher than that of faculty. From 2006 to 2012, the top-level administrators at UMD, the chancellor, the vice chancellors, the associate vice chancellors, the deans, and the associate deans, saw their salaries increase 29%. Now, this does not include augmentations. This is just base salaries. Conversely, faculty saw their salaries increase over that same period roughly 10%, which is well below the 16% that would have been necessary just to keep up with inflation. Now, faculty, like administrators and our often underpaid staff, also had to begin paying higher out-of-pocket costs for the university's health plan. And a few years ago, new faculty saw the university's contribution to the retirement accounts decrease, which created, in essence, a 2-tiered faculty structure. So what's the upshot? Top-level administrative salaries have increased nearly 3 times more than those of faculty. And while faculty salaries have not kept up with inflation, which basically means that faculty have taken a pay cut, top-level administrative salaries have grown far above the rate of inflation. How do we account for this increased money for top administrator salaries? Well, administrators like to justify their pay by citing this nebulous thing called the market. That is, we have to pay market salaries to attract the best people. But the data suggests that the market seems to work only for administrators, at least if we use our below-market faculty salaries as a guide. Indeed, faculty salaries at UMD are at the bottom end of our peer institutions. And in fairness, I should note that our local administration recognizes this problem and has begun to try to address it. The resistance that we've seen has come mostly from the Twin Cities. We've also, however, seen administrators benefit from a peculiar arrangement in which their starting salaries are often higher than the end salary of the person they replaced. Now, by way of context, this isn't how things really work with faculty. For the faculty in the room, you know that when a senior member of the faculty retires, a newly minted PhD is hired at a substantially lower salary. Things work differently for administrators. When our most recent past president left the University of Minnesota presidency in 2011, his base salary was $455,000. Now, this does not include other forms of compensation, benefits, retirement, bonuses, nor does it include the Riverside University mansion in which he lived or the budgets he enjoyed for entertaining, travel, etc. Now, while this pay may be well below that of many corporate chieftains, and indeed of some other university presidents, the base salary is high enough to raise questions, at least in my mind, about what we mean by public service, particularly as our university president enjoyed a base salary higher than that of, say, the President of the United States. But if that past university president left his position at what I would consider in excess of $455,000 per year, our current U of M president began his position at the even higher $610,000 per year. And we've seen evidence of similar trends at UMD. According to Human Resources data, our most recent former Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs retired at the end of 2011 after many years in the position with a base salary of approximately $166,000. According to these same data, his replacement began with a base salary of $220,000. Sorry, Andrew. Our most recent former Vice Chancellor for Student Life, according to the salary database maintained by the St. Paul Pioneer Press, was making $146,000 when he left the job. His successor began in 2011 with a base salary of $155,000. And in fact, in her second year in the position, her reported base salary showed a raise of greater than 4%, which I think is significant because faculty that year received raises of 2.5%. Finally, our most recent former chancellor retired in 2011 after more than 10 years in the position with a base salary of $233,000. According to Human Resources data, our current chancellor began the position with a base salary of $250,000. Now, his base salary the following year was approximately $258,000, which means he received a raise, again, considerably greater than the 2.5% that faculty received that same year. And that was, for faculty, by the way, coming after 2 of the 3 previous years not getting any raise at all. Now, to be fair, I don't blame the chancellor for the raise that he received. Frankly, I, like many of my colleagues, would gladly accept a larger raise from the president or the regents. I wish the Twin Cities administration would show the faculty at UMD the same generosity that it's shown to our administrators. Our local administrators, again, in fairness, recognize how faculty have fared at UMD and have been very supportive of increasing faculty pay here. The resistance that we've seen, again, has come largely from the Twin Cities. Now, the data that I briefly discussed here tonight are, I think, troubling and important, and they raise questions about who we value and how much. They also speak to concerns on which we undoubtedly, I think, should be acting. But I hope that we can also think bigger. As a campus community, faculty, administrators, staff, we all want to do right by our students. We've gotten a raw deal from the state, which for years before the current legislature, and I appreciate Senator Hogemiller pointing this out, which for years before the current legislature cut back on the investments that it made in its young people, decreasing funding for public higher education, which resulted, of course, in higher tuitions, thus higher debt, for those wanting to go to college. And we need to work hard to continue to reverse that trend. At UMD, we've also gotten a raw deal from the Twin Cities, which is far more bloated than this campus, and which has provided us with roughly 1/3 of the operations and maintenance dollars per student contact hour, as has been provided to the Twin Cities. And this is frankly outrageous, and it's something we also need to be working to reverse. If President Kaler intends to cut $90 million of administrative spending over the next 6 years, a portion of that savings must come back to UMD. Our students desperately need it. So I hope, in closing, that we can unite around a shared vision to, yes, attend to some of the problems revealed by the available data, but for all of us, faculty, administrators, staff, to fight for our students, to fight for our campus, and to ensure that we have the resources we need to meet our collective obligation to graduate thoughtful, critical, and productive members of our state and our global society. Thank you.